You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I grew up in a mud hut in a Zulu village in a very remote rural part of South Africa. In my KasiNomic Revolution, my third book, I said that the informal business sector is the next economic frontier. There's a real opportunity by partnering and enabling these businesses to transform our continent. We need to build models which work on how do we aggregate these businesses. The tendency is that brands and marketers do not recognize the uniqueness of an African consumer. Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent the world has ever seen.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Gigi Alcock, who is an author, speaker, marketer, and founder of KasiNomic. Welcome to the podcast, Gigi. How are you?
Great. I'm very good. Thank you, Tessa.
I'm extremely excited about today's conversation. I've been reading a lot of excerpts and pieces of your books and your blogs and all the thought leadership that you have online and offline. So before we get started, I was hoping you can give us a little bit of an introduction. Tell us a bit about Gigi Alcock, because I know you have an extremely interesting and unique story.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, so I grew up in a mud hut in a Zulu village in a very remote rural part of South Africa. My parents were community workers and political activists, and they believed the only real way to kind of work with people and connect with them was to live like them. So they built a mud hut in this Zulu area, and we had no running water, no electricity, lived like the locals. We walked to the river to wash in the local river, the Tugela River, and we had a gas cylinder that was a gas stove that was kind of kitchen under a thorn bush. And our school desk was another stone table under another thorn bush. And basically grew up amongst the Zulu kids. We herded goats and hunted and stick fought very much like all the other kids. And then from there, I always felt I was incredibly poor. We had very little in terms of toys and TVs and other things, but we were very rich in lifestyle and culture, and obviously got to speak the language fluently and understand the lifestyle. And I went from there. I was a political activist for a while as well, against apartheid at the time. And then with the kind of new South Africa, moved into business and kind of recognized my parents couldn't afford to send me to university. And I realized that without any kind of formal knowledge, one of my abilities was to allow people access and introduce people into in essence, township and rural societies that were hidden to most people as a factor of not only apartheid, but also geographies that had been created by apartheid meant that most people lived in township areas and in rural areas that were hidden away, restricted. So my real first business was to create access into these places, and that morphed eventually into a marketing business where we were the first people to market to these kind of informal or hidden environments. I had a business called Mina Nawe Marketing. In Zulu, Mina Nawe means you and I. And that was kind of, I guess, my real kind of path to fame and fortune was marketing to these societies and these economies.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that overview of your unique upbringing and how it's shaped the direction you've taken now. So as you've touched upon, you've dedicated a large part of your life to understanding the dynamics of the informal business sector in Africa. So why the informal sector? What is it about the sector that has made you so passionate about it?
So on one hand, it represents very large business opportunity, and I'll talk to some of the huge businesses that we've helped enable in that space. I think more importantly, the vast proportion of our societies in Africa are in essence in the kind of environment I'm talking about, and whether those are rural, whether those are are city urbanized environments. Generally, the vast proportion of consumers, if that's who you're looking for, and small and informal businesses, not so small in many cases, all of this kind of vast proportion of our society lives in these spaces, does business in this environment, and of course have very unique lifestyles, very unique cultures. And in this, we should be supporting, enabling these businesses. If they're customers of ours or potential consumers of ours, again, we should be understanding them more intimately. And then last of all, I think that there's a real need for us to transform Africa and African economies through recognizing these economies, recognizing how they operate, and being able to enable these businesses through reciprocal business arrangements to become bigger, to become more profitable, employ more people, and so on. And we can really transform our societies through this. And in my KasiNomic Revolution, my third book, I said that the informal business sector is the next economic frontier in a world of small people doing big things. And that they were transforming the continent and would continue to transform the continent. And so, from a passion perspective, I really feel passionately that the economic revolution is coming from these. So it's a combination of, there's a business opportunity, there's a need to understand the sector, and third of all, there's a real opportunity by partnering and enabling these businesses to transform our continent.
Thank you for that, Gigi. You mentioned there how the informal sector represents a huge opportunity, as it is a vast proportion of African society and it should be understood. So in terms of its understanding from the perspective of a business owner, what do you need to know about the African informal sector?
I think the starting point is recognizing that these are businesses. I use an example of if you go to downtown Johannesburg, it's kind of this buzzing kind of mix of street traders and little kind of kiosks and so on. And I often joke to people, I say, like, as you walk into downtown Johannesburg, you enter Lagos.
You actually do.
And of course, it feels like that. And it feels like that because one of the things I found in the work I've done in different countries in Africa is recognize that the informal economy is almost identical. There's a lot of local and cultural nuance, but in essence, the way these businesses operate is very similar. And, as an example, in downtown Joburg, if you walk down the street there's a granny, what we call a gogo in South Africa. And this granny and her husband sell 3,000 what's called vetkoek, in essence, the croissant of the township, the breakfast of the township. They sell 3,000 vetkoek for R1 each. And they sell about 500 rands worth of tea and coffee and inclusions that go into these vetkoek. And of course, she turns over, her and her husband have been doing this for 10 years. They turn over around about 3,500 Rand a day, 6 days a week. They make about a 50% margin on this. And so they make themselves more than $2,000 a month profit. Yes. And which is a lot of money anyway, but especially in this kind of space. And when we walk past her, we kind of go, oh, shame, and we feel sorry for her, not recognizing how big their business is. And of course, they're building a 2-story house in a fairly plush suburb in Soweto, and again, the mistake we make is walking past them. And the same happens in the streets of in Lusaka. You get something called a vitumbura, which is like a breakfast, almost roll or bun. And you have the Maasai ladies in Lagos doing this and so on. So in many cases, different food, but this vibrant thing. And all of these people are actually making substantially decent incomes. there are hundreds of thousands of them in different sectors, some selling dry goods, some selling clothing, some selling food, like the one I mentioned. And they all are, buying the products that they use for their food and stuff from people like, Unilever or Parmalat or Tiger Brands in South Africa. These are the real customers. These are the consumers. These are the business consumers of many of these products. And if you don't recognize them, A, as business people, and B, recognize the opportunity they represent, you in essence only addressing a very small proportion of the population. I think the other thing is we tend to look at consumers or shoppers as a kind of almost direct kind of, we want to supply them directly, and we don't recognize the incredibly powerful role played by the intermediaries, in essence, by these businesses who are either cooking the food or supplying the, groceries and so on. And I think that business sector is actually the critical part of any route to market, any successful brand. One of my kind of claims to fame is that we introduced Parmalat cheese slices into, these are individually wrapped cheese slices made by Parmalat.
Yes.
And we introduced them into the township economy. And we introduced them through the Vet Cook that I mentioned, which is the kind of breakfast croissant of the space. And then there's something called a gorda. Gorda is a quarter loaf of bread with a kind of fried potato chips and slice of polony and sauces and so on. In essence, a kind of hamburger of this kind of space. And it's called a gorda, K-O-T-A, because it's, of course, a quarter loaf of bread. We introduced the cheese slices into this space, into these two channels in about 2005, and we built around about, a 4 billion rand a year sector. Now the rand is 15 rand to $1. We'll work that out, but 4 billion odd was around about a 10 billion. Yes, anyway, we'll work out the numbers, but a 4 billion rand sector that never existed before. And this is across a range of brands of which Parmalat led this space. And we launched cheese slices in Zambia in the local food stuff. And we launched them in Mozambique and in pao, which is the bread that they make there. And each one of these places, we very successfully launched cheese slices into this informal economy and created really, really big business sectors. And so, to a business person, these are not, insubstantial opportunities. They're really, really big opportunities. The difference is that we need to understand how these businesses operate. In many cases, particularly in the fast food sector, they're making culturally relevant or locally relevant dishes or offerings like a gorda, like a Vet Cook, like pao and so on. And so that's the one hand we need to recognize that. They generally operate on a slightly different level, and we need to understand that. And then there's also the opportunity to, what we did with Parmalat is we engaged with these businesses with the loyalty scheme, which in essence invested in growing these businesses. And we were able to really create a very, very powerful business where Parmalat, I take this quite personally, as you can hear, but we're basically, we invested in these businesses and we were able to grow the size of each one of these businesses and their profitability at the same time as we created very loyal, businesses that are very loyal to the Parmalat brand and could retain more than 80% market share, even with cheaper competitors. And so we have to look at kind of slightly different business models once we recognize it. I think the other thing that we have to look at is that, I asked someone from Unilever a few years ago. I said to them, "Who is your biggest customer?" And they said to me, "It's ShopRite, the retailer." And I said, "No, you're incorrect." I said, "ShopRite is your single biggest customer. It is not your biggest customer. Your 100,000 of what we call spaza shops is your biggest customer." And so we need to understand this kind of concept that the informal economies are highly fragmented. And the
Yes.
opportunities lie in aggregation models. I mean, if you look at what is Uber's success or Airbnb's success, the success of these businesses is aggregating hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of drivers or beds, aggregating them on a in this case, an app, having a payment platform, and having a customer, a customer marketing opportunity. But let's leave that aside and the tech of the payments. But the power of Uber is recognizing that 1 million drivers is more powerful than 100,000 taxis. And the same with beds. 1 million beds is going to be more powerful as a platform if you can aggregate it than a couple of very large hotel chains. So. And the same applies to the informal sector. We need to build models which work on how do we aggregate these businesses. And most of the case, I think the opportunity lies in using technology where we can aggregate ordering models, payment systems, and so on within this space. And so when we understand these fragmented businesses and we can apply aggregation models, payment platforms, and so on to these businesses, there's a lot of opportunity lies in there.
Thank you, Gigi. You've touched on some extremely key and important points. You've mentioned the misconceptions of the informal sector and how we need to understand them and the power of the informal sector, which is what I'm assuming KasiNomic is about and is a phrase that you coined.
Yeah, my problem with the term informal sector is that it implies the word informal implies unstructured, unsophisticated, low technology, low profit, disorganized, and unsophisticated. And you can carry on mentioning these terms. And of course, the informal economy, as it's called, does not represent any of these. I prefer to call it, the independent economy, because these are non-corporatized and they're individuals in many cases independently operating. So whatever we want to call them, my feeling was that I wanted to change people's mindset. And in the townships in South Africa, the trendy, cool name for what used to be ghettos and today are thriving spaces is Ikasi. And Kasi is the South African term for the township. So KasiNomics was obviously the term for township economies. But it was really just a term that would change people's mindset rather than it's not representative only of the South African townships. I mean, when I was in Lagos and looking at the businesses, they were KasiNomic professors,
yes.
Many of those businesses. So it was really just coining a term that would change people's headspace around, the minute you say, economics, and people kind of lift their heads and say, oh, wow, is there an economy there? So KasiNomics was my first business book. And it in essence was saying, and it was the first time, certainly in South Africa, that anyone had really gone out and said, hey, guys, this is a huge economy. It's a structured, organized, sophisticated economy with fairly large businesses operating very successfully. And that was in 2013, 2014. And of course, many people just couldn't believe the things I was saying. And then when I wrote KasiNomic Revolution was kind of me saying and believing very strongly that there's a revolution happening in these spaces. KasiNomics was saying, hey, do you know this space exists? And literally in the space of 4 or 5 years since the writing of KasiNomics, I could see there was this revolution happening throughout these economic sectors, and hence the KasiNomic Revolution. And the subtitle was The Rise of African Informal Economies. I think the next one will probably be KasiNomics Unleashed, because the momentum of this informal economy and its growth is just continues unabated.
I love that. I love the phrase, the independent economy, and how you've articulated how the phrase informal suggests that it's disorganized and unstructured, which leads me to the point. Why do brands, both global and local, so often fail when they're attempting to access this informal market in Africa? Is it through these misconceptions that it's disorganized, it's unstructured? Why do they fail? What's your thoughts on this?
So I think there's two levels to it, and they're two completely connected parts of it. On the first side, if we look at the consumer, the tendency is that brands and marketers do not recognize the uniqueness of an African consumer. And here I share, you interviewed my good friend Faye.
Yes.
We share the sense that, that the tendency is that people see African kind of, relatively affluent consumers as coconuts, that they have become brown on the outside, they're brown on the outside, but are white on the inside, and that they've become westernized. And this is a huge mistake because in nowhere in the world do people just westernize. Most people actually modernize, and as they modernize, they bring with them strong lifestyle and cultural elements or nuances. And there's this concept of fast and slow culture, where fast culture being the adoption of technology and so on, and a slow culture being the slower change of our kind of social norms and cultural elements. And we often confuse, culture and tradition. Tradition is in the past, is very ritualistic and so on. But culture is actually where the key lies. And as culture evolves and as this consumer evolves, they remain what I call Afropolitans, which is in essence culturally African, or Xhosa or Zulu or Tswana or any tribe, Maasai, whatever it might be throughout the continent. These are very strong cultural things that evolve and modernize, but stay quite true to their cultural roots. And these people at the same time can be ultra modern. And so the mistake is that by not recognizing the kind of strength of culture and lifestyle, and lifestyle and culture are incredibly intertwined, because the food that we eat, which is part of our kind of lifestyle, is related in many cases to cultural norms and cultural desires and so on, and things like marriage and funerals and other life moments and so on are also very strongly linked to culture and lifestyle. So and I could go on for this for a long time, but the point about it is that on the one hand, the recognition, then the need to recognize this unique African consumer, whether they're an Afropolitan or the modern villager, as Faye calls them, is a really important starting point. And consumption of brands by this consumer is often on their own terms, which brands don't, they're showing a guy in New York and they think this is aspirational, and yet the consumer is consuming the brand in a completely different environment and seeing completely different cues to what actually makes it important. If their family recognizing them consuming a certain brand in Africa is more important than being seen as individualistic and so on. So brands often miss this point completely. And it should be part of their DNA, recognition of culture and how a part of your brand and understanding lifestyle. But deep, important things about lifestyle are very important. On the opposite side, and as I said, very intertwined, is this inability to recognize these economic sectors that in essence are the channels of these brands and products to consumers. And those could be everything from what's called a spaza shop in South Africa, an informal retail store, or a Gorda outlet I mentioned. You get what's called a Shisanyama in South Africa, which is like a meat grilling store. There's a huge sector in traditional herbal medicine. The Muti sector is a 10 billion rand a year sector, almost $1 billion sector, and so on. So there's these huge sectors, and each one of these sectors operate in a unique way, and they recognize geographies. They're able to trade in certain environments. They understand certain consumer nuances and so on. If we look at the housing sector in South Africa and most parts of Africa, the housing sectors are vibrant spaces, and it's not just shacks. This is a misconception, is that most of African housing is shacks, is beautiful, amazing houses form the majority of formal kind of housing. And people build these without home loans. There's very little financing of this. And generally the financing is run through what in South Africa called stokvels, which are communal buying groups.
Yes.
There's other forms of financing and so on. And so if one understands, how these sectors operate from a business perspective, one's able to interface with them better. And I think, we have this crazy thing where, corporates believe that all we've got to do is have the cheapest possible product delivered as close to people as possible, and lose this kind of idea of actually I've got to create loyalty and a relationship with the retailer who's the channel. I've got to create a connection with my consumer. It's not just about price. It's a lot more other value elements. And when we can interface with both the call it the business, this independent business person who's my channel to my consumer, and also deliver a message to my consumer in a way that really resonates, one has a very, very powerful franchise in the space. And currently, very few people are very successful in this, in essence, in inverted commas, informal economy anywhere in Africa, because they haven't adapted to these two kind of sides. They may be successful to an extent on one element, but then they're not on the other. And yet there's massive opportunities to recognize this.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Gigi. So you've detailed, I guess, the mistakes that brands make in terms of they don't understand the influence of culture and lifestyle on African consumers, and that very few are successful in understanding or being successful in this space. So what can brands do to better understand the informal market consumer and to develop strategies that resonate with those consumers so that they can be successful in the market sector?
You mean outside of paying Faye and myself?
Yes, outside of that. Obviously, I don't want you to give away your trade secrets, but you can give us some top line tips.
They can buy my book.
Brilliant. It's a great book. I recommend it very highly.
No, on a serious note, I think the starting point is recognizing that we need to understand the sector better. It amazes me that there's not enough of that recognition of, hey, we don't understand the sector better. We need to get closer to it. And how do you get close to it? You go and connect with them and listen to them and understand how their businesses operate. So, I spend a huge amount of time in that space, and I take, companies. I had a company I took around Soweto yesterday who are interested in supplying furniture to, they have a very large furniture business, and they're wanting to supply into this space. And when I took them into people's houses, they suddenly were like aghast for a number of things. But the primary one was they suddenly realized people's sense of fashion and what decor they wanted in their house and what furniture was different to what they were supplying. The second thing they recognized was that many of the spaces were larger than they expected, because they had a perception in their mind that most of these houses were crowded little tiny houses, and they were going into these bedrooms and suddenly saying, hey, we shouldn't be offering single beds. We should be offering king size beds with huge headboards and now, when they're walking in and seeing these things, it just completely changed their mindsets. And then there's also a large percentage of our population, about 27% in South Africa, or a quarter odd of our households are single people households. So in essence, one person households. Now, I've long said that there's an opportunity around IKEA type offerings. IKEA would offer things like a dining room table that turned into a desk, that turned into a bed, and that kind of thing for a small single person household. These guys, when I took them around, they were walking in and seeing these what are called back rooms in Soweto, where people so the main houses were larger than they expected, and these back rooms were single room that was in essence a kitchen, a lounge, and a bedroom all in one. And we're like, oh my God, all the things that we make are going to be too big to fit in here, or they're not multi-purpose. So, so they're going away to redesign everything from what the fashion is to the size and offerings, both to larger and smaller options. This is a fundamental shift in their business strategy, and the scale of it, they just couldn't believe. But the lesson is, we need to understand this by literally walking in the footsteps of our consumers and our shoppers. So that's the one. The other thing that, just using this furniture business as an example, is that, they were looking at setting up their own stores in the township space. And I took them and introduced them to a whole bunch of independent furniture stores, people who are already supplying the space. Yes. And said to them, well, why don't you, instead of you having to go and build a store and furnish it and employ staff and deal with all of these issues, why don't you engage these guys that they become your network? Yeah. And when they went and spoke to these businesses, these guys were saying, we'd love to. And interesting, many, and the furniture company, the large corporate, was saying, we're going to need to offer lay-by options or buy now and pay later options. And we're going to have to do credit checks to people if they're buying. And then when we went to these businesses that were independent businesses selling furniture, they were like, no, where people don't pay cash. I said, yeah, but we're selling to people in our suburb. We know them. We don't need to do a credit check on them. We know they can afford it or not. And we don't need your finance. We cover the finance ourselves. You just supply us with furniture at a good price, deliver it to us, and it was extraordinary. It was suddenly you saw these connections where they could help these businesses and enable them and help these businesses grow, and at the same time grow their business. They were seeing there was a different need for fashion and size of the furniture and which types of furniture they wanted. And this is really just by spending. I mean, we spend 4 hours in there, and they fundamentally will change their business strategy. And then the kind of follow on from that is once you understood that really well is really the marketing and communication of that. And I think a lot of marketing communication to this space is very poor because it doesn't take into consideration cultural nuance, colloquial language, these kind of elements. And so, again, it's really about, and many of these companies are taking a national campaign and literally changing the voiceover, which is just very, limited benefit. So getting to know and then adapting your marketing and your distribution and stuff to the nuances of the sector, can be very, very successful. And that's what I would say to business. Get closer to this market, not go about doing focus groups and research, by actually walking the streets, understanding, connecting with people, connecting with these business people, and then building your strategies around that.
I agree 100%. You have to get on the ground, get to know people, speak to them, get close. Brilliant advice. So you've given some top tips and real life examples on how brands can better understand the informal market and the informal market consumers. So what are some of the myths that you'd like to dispel about the informal sector in Africa?
One of them, I think, is around that they're low tech. I'll just give you an example. There's a guy called Revoluti who's a baker in a part of Soweto. He operates a little bakery making rolls and bread and stuff, and he operates from a shipping container. And when the lockdown came, he really struggled because he used to deliver to shops that were reselling his bread, and he was also delivering to some corporate clients and so on. And so when lockdown happened, he moved he put his offering. He opened a Facebook page, and on his Facebook page, Boroto Bakery, he put his range of bread and rolls and so on, and he invited people to send him a WhatsApp with what's called EPIN. EPIN is your location. People say, send me your EPIN, your PIN. So anyway, he's invited people to, and he was selling about 500 loaves of bread a day from his shipping container. And then he invited people on his Facebook page, or Facebook Lite. Actually, most people operating on Facebook Lite. He invited people to send them their orders and their PIN locations with their orders. And then he had about 6 guys with trolleys who would go and deliver the bread to these PIN locations and the specific orders that had been ordered. And he grew his business over lockdown, over the real tight lockdown we had, grew from 500 loaves of bread to more than 2,000 loaves of bread a day by literally moving on to a form of e-commerce, which was this kind of Facebook Lite as your kind of call it online store, and then using WhatsApp and PIN and a PIN location on WhatsApp as your kind of ordering system. And we've seen that this has become really popular. I mean, I've got a photo of a Somali trader in Johannesburg at a wholesaler, and he's on 3 smartphones at the same time. He's got 1 smartphone against his ear, and he's got 2 others in the palm of his hands, and he's busy checking for pricing while he's comparing to the shelf in front of him. So, one of the misconceptions is this sense that people are kind of, technologically ignorant. And yet people use technology, and things like Facebook Lite and WhatsApp, I believe, in Africa will be the next form of e-commerce, much, much more readily accepted and used than things like, Shopify or an app or even a website. So the sense of technology is using appropriate technology, the technology that is utilized by people. And then you suddenly realize, the sophistication of that. I think the other misconception around it is that these are very small businesses. And I mentioned the granny who's doing, $2,000 a month profit. And there's many, many of these that are fairly substantial businesses. And so when we take our minds out of that and we kind of say, okay, these are actually substantial businesses, suddenly they represent an opportunity that's far bigger than we give it credit for. The other thing is that most of these businesses have been in business for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and have established how they operate, that they've really become very astute to understanding who their consumer is, who their shopper is, and so on. Now, any business that's been in place for 10 years is a very sustainable business. And often there's a sense that these are transient businesses. They're here one day, then they're gone, and so on. No, many of these businesses have been there for years and so on. So again, it's a real mindset change around who the sector is and that they're not low tech, that they're not unsophisticated, that they're not permanent and so on. One of the huge opportunities I believe exist in this kind of space again is also building in short-term working capital loans, if you want, into this kind of space. And if you look at most of these businesses, the thing that holds them back is that they have to pay cash right now for their purchases, and they're not able to have terms. Now, if you look at a retailer like ShopRite, Walmart, any one of these guys, they're getting stock from Procter & Gamble or Unilever or whoever it might be. They're getting 30 days, 60 days, 90 days kind of terms. And they're able to then roll cash and carry large amounts of stock on their shelf. We never offer this to businesses in this so-called informal economy. And I think that one of the liberating factors is how to build that kind of thing. And if a business been in place for 10 years, why can't we offer them terms? And when we offer them terms, pay in 5 days' time or 7 or 14 or 30 days, this is short-term kind of terms, you're able to allow that business to stock more of your product and therefore sell more of your product versus where they stock up now and then tomorrow they've got to stock up again. The next day they've got to stock up again. So working capital, rotating credit, whatever you want to call it, terms on purchases is one of the things that really is transformative and has the opportunity to be transformative. And when a business can offer that, when a multinational can offer that to their customers, because they have a relationship, because they have a connection, it can be transformative in both directions.
So one of the points which I agree with is that you gave some great examples of how modern the informal sector is and how technology is being used successfully to grow businesses in the informal sector. So if we touch upon some of the great work you've done, you've had some great successes launching recognizable brands in Africa. For example, you were responsible for launching Indomie noodles in South Africa. I don't think it gets bigger than that. Can you tell us how that came about and how you went about successfully launching the brand in South Africa?
Yeah, sure. So, just a starting point, it was launched in South Africa under the Kellogg's brand. Kellogg's and the Tolaram Group who own who distribute and market Indomie noodles in Nigeria. And a lot of West Africa, they made a joint venture with Kellogg's. And so the brand was launched under the Kellogg's brand name in South Africa. But I mean, the Tolaram Group is an extraordinary business that does more than $1 billion in instant noodles with their Indomie brand in Nigeria alone. And they built that business. In 10 years, they made Nigeria the 5th biggest consumer of instant noodles on the planet, and so on and so forth. It's just a really extraordinary, and Indomie brand, I think, is ranked as one of the top 5 consumer brands in Africa. And how did they do that? So the thing is, with the Tolaram Group has a sub-business who does their distribution, who distributes to more than 500 points of distribution, literally on a weekly basis. And they distribute only to the informal sector. I mean, as you would know, Nigeria is an informal economy. I think 96% of that economy is, particularly retail, is informal. So one of the things that Tolaram Group recognized is what is one of the biggest pain points in Africa. One of the biggest pain points in Africa is fuel for cooking, whether that is electricity, paraffin, charcoal, firewood, and so on, is a real issue. And of course, instant noodles, in 3 minutes, you've got noodles, resolves that. The second thing they recognized was that noodles are high in protein compared to, say, maize meal or cassava meal, which are the staples in many parts of Africa. They were almost triple amount of protein in noodles. And then what they did is that people in Africa generally want a far more filling kind of product. So they took, in essence, a snack for rich kids in the Western world, and they, instead of having a 70-gram sachet, they had 150 and a 200 and a 300-gram sachet called a belly full and a hungry man, and so on. So you had this really filling, large amount, high protein, easy to cook. And then, of course, they understood the distribution of the informal sector, and they distributed and sampled through things like the Mashai ladies, with the street food sellers in Nigeria. They distributed through the informal economy, through hawkers, tabletops, the equivalent of our spaza shops, and so on. So when they approached me originally, I said to the guys, listen, there is no way that you're going to launch instant noodles successfully in South Africa. There's already Maggi 2-minute noodles and a few others. I kind of was like, no, you're wasting your time. And of course, we had this, and they invited me to come to Lagos. And I'd really always wanted to go to Lagos. And by the 3rd day I was in Lagos, I was like, okay, we're going to launch in South Africa, because I'd recognize the things. And of course, first of all, you just realize that the informal economy in Lagos was almost identical to the informal economy in a place like Soweto or Johannesburg and so on. So the one condition I was given by the Tolaram Kellogg's team was that there would be no formal distribution of the product. No formal wholesalers and no formal retailers in South Africa. We would only do it through the informal sector. And we did. We launched it through the spaza sector, as I call it, through what we call MIDI wholesalers or independent wholesalers. We sampled it extensively at township schools and sometimes fast food outlets. And basically, in the space of a very short time, in 2 or 3 years, Kellogg's Noodles under the Tolaram Group is now the largest noodle in the market, has grown the market, I think, by almost triple. now, of course, you can find it at formal retail and formal wholesalers, but in essence built this incredible giant and very, very successful product category in South Africa, emulating the Nigerian model. And my business, Mina Nawe, we basically did this launch. I think it was about 2016, we launched it. And today, Kellogg's Noodles, the leading brand, distribution at the very, very lowest levels of the economy, at the smallest little outlet. And it was really about understanding those rules of engagement from, as I mentioned earlier, from marketing and connecting with the kids and the moms, understanding the channel, the spaza shops, the spazarettes, the midi wholesalers, cash and carries, the sector, understanding the food sector, and really building it on that. And the rest is history, and they continue to grow. They've set up a very strong foundation. In the space of 3 or 4 years, they've in essence been a brand that is a key product on the shelf of an informal store anywhere in the country, and something that Nestle took has been trying for probably 10 years, if not longer, with their Maggie 2-minute noodles, and were unsuccessful. And within a very short time, the Tolaram Group, and I will always add, with myself and my business, were able to achieve this by just following certain rules in these sectors.
That's an amazing example detailing the size and opportunity of the informal sector by using Tolaram Group and Indomie noodles as an example, which leads on to one of the points that you discuss, which is how the informal business sector is the next great frontier of Africa, and he says it's undergoing an economic revolution. So what does this economic revolution look like, and what is its significance to Africa's overall economic development?
Sure. So let's just start with the consumer or the population trend. And the trend, Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent we've ever seen, that the world has ever seen. The vast proportion of Africa today, outside of tourist brochures for high-end luxury lodges, is in essence urban, and not informal urban. I'm talking formal homes, proper formal structures, and so on. And yes, of course, there are informal dwellings everywhere in Africa, but they most of the time increasingly actually represent a small percentage. In South Africa, as an example, informal dwellings, I've had people, CEOs of top banks, telling me that 80% of our population live in informal dwellings, and the correct figure is only 12% of our households live in informal dwellings. It is a fundamental difference, and the same would apply in Nigeria, with super cities like Lagos with 20 million people. Very urban. And those are not people who've moved from a rural area. These are people who are multi-generationally urban. They have been urban. Their parents were urban, and their parents' parents were urban before them. And while there are people who've moved from the rural areas, the majority of our societies and households in Africa are urban. The majority of them are carry a mobile phone, and know how to use it. And the majority of those mobile phones are smartphones with probably Facebook Lite and WhatsApp preloaded on those phones. The other important thing is increasingly the vast proportion of those households are single or small households. So this concept of a large African family was true 10, 20 years ago, and maybe true in small percentages. But for instance, in South Africa, more than 70% of our households are between 4 people and 1 person households. And you will find the same in Nairobi, you'll find the same in Nigeria. So what we're seeing is this transformation. I mean, everyone talks about how young our population is. I mean, that's kind of accepted. But what we don't see is that we're talking about urban, formal, and small households are what represents the vast proportion of our consumers with a high level of sophistication and expectation from the brands they consume and so on. On the opposite side is that we have this huge amount of, in essence, what are called informal businesses. But these are businesses that are not informal as in total informal, and they increasingly are formalizing, but they're formalizing in a hybrid manner. So they may have a formal structure where they used to have an informal kind of makeshift structure. Now they've got a brick and mortar store. They used to operate using cash. Now they're accepting more and more electronic payments, whether those are EFTs or card swipes or M-Pesa in many parts. These are businesses where their parents were the founders of these businesses. The parent was the one who was standing on the street corner selling whatever they were selling. The son grew up with their parents selling this, and actually you've got a second generation of business people who are brought up by parents who were not themselves, business people. And this means that once you have a second or third generation business person, those business people really understand that business, whether that's a fast food business, whether it's an alcohol business, whether it's a building, a construction business, furniture business, and so on. So this means that you now suddenly have a far more sophisticated, almost hybrid, formal, informal, and many times they say what they prefer to keep informal makes sense to them for various reasons.
Yes.
Sometimes it's flexibility, sometimes it's not having to deal with authorities or tax regimes and so on. And sometimes it's there's the informal basis of their business is what makes it successful. There's this mix of formal and informal. And what's happening is this kind of sophistication of these businesses is accelerating really rapidly. And it's also enabling people like Wasoko and Jumia and all of these kind of unicorns we hear about. It's allowing them to become more successful. It's not just that Wasoko's arrived. Wasoko is meeting halfway with the business that is requiring certain formal offerings. And so this different consumer with a hybridizing, if you want, and formalizing business that's far more sophisticated is accelerating and will continue to accelerate. There's a saying, when the pace of change outside your business exceeds the pace of change inside your business is dead. And so if corporates and multinationals and so on do not recognize how the pace of change outside their business is accelerating, they will increasingly become outdated and left behind. And so it's very important we understand the pace of change and this kind of revolution happening at both a consumer level and at a business level within the space. And there's an incredible book called Factfulness by Hans Rosling, and Factfulness points to how we don't understand the information often, or we don't interpret it correctly. And a lot of the information about Africa and about these things is there, but often people are misinterpreting it because they're viewing it through glasses that tell them these are informal, rural, unsophisticated, poor people. And while those people may exist, they are the minority. And when we put on different glasses and we look at the information at our disposal, we'll recognize that there's a different consumer in Africa, there's a different business person in Africa, and it's about time that we develop relationships that are based much more on equality and reciprocal benefit than extractive and purely supplier kind of, we'll sell you this and you should be grateful that we can deliver it to you kind of relationships.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Gigi. You've raised some extremely interesting points there. You've detailed the evolution of informal businesses and how these businesses are passed down through generations and becoming almost hybrids in terms of they sit between being informal and informal businesses and are becoming sophisticated at a very rapid pace. So if you look at the evolution and trends in terms of what we see in Africa a lot of the time is the trends from the informal sector massively flow into the formal sector or influence the formal sector. I guess things like fintech being a prime example. What are some of the recent or current trends in the informal sector that you're excited about and we should be excited about?
Yeah, I would say that you mentioned fintech, and I think fintech has been applied differently throughout. Africa had different success. In South Africa, M-Pesa was not successful. We don't have mobile money, the same as M-Pesa elsewhere. But I think the heart of this, to a large extent, is I think that smartphones are a real enabling element in Africa, and particularly within the smartphone environment, Facebook and WhatsApp. And probably if I had to remove Facebook out of it, probably one of the single biggest thing is the use of WhatsApp.
Yes.
Data is a major issue in Africa. It's generally very expensive. WhatsApp and in parts of Africa, particularly in South Africa, you buy a WhatsApp bundle, so you don't pay for the data. You pay a single amount of money. You then have you have unlimited WhatsApps within that bundle, and so this has meant this is incredibly rapid adoption of WhatsApp. But also WhatsApp is reflective of African, the meeting, the gathering of elders under a tree has now moved to a group on WhatsApp. Yeah, and I really believe that WhatsApp's one of its biggest strengths is that Africa is a communal networked society. And so when WhatsApp groups come along, people are like, hey, this makes sense because I'm networked, physically, I guess. When we gather at the tree, we gather at the church, we gather at the funeral or the unveiling ceremony. And we all have this group and whatever. And suddenly now we just do it on a WhatsApp. And so I think WhatsApp has been hugely enabling. And obviously WhatsApp business allows a lot more kind of opportunity. So I think, the trend towards the utilization of and if you look at Facebook Lite as an example, you cannot go. I took one of the international beer brand CEO around who just come from Nigeria. I took him around to show him taverns and alcohol outlets, taverns and restaurants, yes, and clubs in the townships. And I'd said to him, every single business has a Facebook page. And he was like, never, couldn't believe it. Every single place he went to, he said, do you have a Facebook page? And they'd open up their Facebook and they'd show him their Facebook. Hair salons. Hair salons use Facebook to profile their offerings and what they've done to their customers, these weaves and these braids and these, various amazing hairstyles are shown on Facebook Lite. And then if you want to book an appointment, you can use WhatsApp that's interfaced with Facebook to send me a WhatsApp. So more than a smartphone, I think those kind of apps have really got a lot of power, and I really think they've done a great thing in terms of it. So that's the one trend is around using of, I guess, a social messaging rather than media platform on smartphones. I think the other big thing is I guess this second generation, in some cases third generation of business people who are now in this space. And if we look in South Africa, we have about 100,000 what we call spaza shops and spazaret supermarket type informal businesses. And the spaza sector has completely disrupted the giants like Walmart. Well, here in South Africa, they trade under Masscash or Macro, Pick n Pay, ShopRite have all been dramatically disrupted by the spaza sector. And the spaza sector is primarily a Somalian, Ethiopian immigrant traders, particularly in South Africa. You find very similar for instance, Zambia with Burundians and Nigerian and Somali traders. And people say to me, why are these guys so successful? But one of the biggest factors is these guys have grown up in their father's shop in either Mogadishu or in some cases in Bangladesh or wherever it might be. And when they arrive and they start trading in the streets of Soweto, as an example, they really get retailing. They really understand it. They have loss leaders. They offer credit without interest on food items to the moms and create a little loyalty group. They have variable margins. So at month end, when they're competing with the ShopRite, they will have a lower price. And in the middle of the month, when people can't afford transport money to go to a formal retailer, they'll be slightly more expensive. They'll do delivery of large things like 12 kgs of maize meal. They'll have a youngster with a trolley who'll push your groceries home for you. You don't get those things at a formal retailer. But they've understood retail really well. And why do they understand retail well? Because they're a second or a third generation retailer. And across almost every one of these things, and it's one of the first things I ask people, where did you learn to do this business?
Very true.
So many times, my father had a business like this. I took it over and I've modernized it. I was talking to an owner of a very nice restaurant, club type of outlet in Soweto a while ago. He said, I took over my father's shop and then I added, I made better toilets for the women because I know women, want nicer and safer toilets. And I offered, so his father had never sold food. He just sold alcohol and had music. He now has the soccer on. He's got UEFA on, and he sells. He's got a menu and he sells food. So what he's done is taken his father's business, kept what's successful, but he's now modernizing it and stuff. And this second or third generation of business people is a growing trend. And essentially, go around when you ask people. I have a list of kind of questions I ask wherever I am. And one of them is that, where did you learn it? And the other one is, are you on Facebook Lite? And are you on WhatsApp? And how many years have you been in business? And these are all kind of indicators of this. And so these are the kind of trends, this kind of new middle class, consumer, smaller, more formal middle class, smaller household. What does that mean? Smaller household means you spend more on yourself because you're not trying to spend on a larger number of people. When you have a formal dwelling, you spend more on design versus function because you live in a formal dwelling. You don't have to keep it warm and stop the water leaking in. You start investing in things like curtains and other things that are more about design and beauty. And so on. So there's this change of what you consume, your mindset changes. And of course, the longer you've been in this kind of space as a business person, the more you're more sophisticated you become. You're not starting at scratch and paying lots of school fees. Your father or your grandfather paid the school fees. You're now just sharpening the wedge in essence.
Fantastic. You've beautifully detailed the trends, the technology in terms of social media and the new generation that are influencing Africa's informal sector going forward. So if we think of in terms of going forward and the future of Africa, where do you see Africa's informal market in, say, 5 years' time?
Sure. We often kind of look at milestones and kind of say, well, this will have changed by then and this will be changed. I think we've got to look at this as an endless continuum. In essence, and the continuum is a perpetually formalizing one on the one hand and a perpetually modernizing one on the other hand. And when I say modernizing, yes. It's very different to kind of westernizing and that kind of element. There's an increasing pride among Africans about their lifestyle, about their culture, about the uniqueness of Africa. And I think one of the mistakes, and we kind of, people have made is this almost assumption that aspiration is Western and aspiration is European and so on and so forth. There is this emerging pride. This new generation is proud of the fact that they are either a certain ethnic group, whether that's Zulu or Xhosa or Sotho in South Africa or whatever it might be elsewhere. There's this pride of it, and there's this greater pride of being African as well, as African as this kind of continent and diaspora. And this is where it will move in 5 years' time. That's growing even faster. And so, and I see it emerging in things like the houses we visited. A lot of them had a very unique African kind of decor. And African decor is, of course, not African prints that came from, or leopard skins, which is a Western's idea of what African is. These were unique to kind of ethnic group, and in some cases, a modern African kind of look. And I mean, in every township house you go into, they have the most elaborate ceilings you've ever seen. I mean, ceilings is considered a real mark of fashion and style in a house. You cannot go into a European house, a Western house, a modern kind of architect designed house anywhere else in South Africa and see ceilings like that. And that's, for me, an example of very African style and fashion statement. And there's many others, going through this, and various music styles and stuff, which are very African. So this Africanness is going to emerge more and more. And within 5 years, it's going to grow. The other element that's going to grow is that the gig economy is growing worldwide. The gig economy is, guess what? Is actually a mirror image of the informal economy, as I mentioned. It's a large number of smaller businesses operating from home. What is the informal sector? A large number of small businesses to medium businesses operating from a residential premises. So with low overheads and so on. So there's going to be this combination on the one hand of this kind of Africanness, this modernization, supported by the continued growth of, call it residential or home-based businesses that will increasingly become more sophisticated. And it's a continuum. So in 5 years' time, we'll be 5 years further away than we are now, but we will not have been a substantially different space. We'll have be less formal. How much so? And according to the category, whether it's a FMCG retailer or construction business or a hair salon and so on, but there is this continuum growing. I think it's critical also that we tend to look at the informal economy as a single amorphous mass. We either think that they're all just FMCG little stores selling dry goods, washing powder, baby food, maize meal and rice and so on, or we just see them all as kind of flea market type hawkers, rows and rows of hawkers. And the reality is that we then apply our models to engage with that based on assuming that all businesses, for argument's sake, in South Africa are spaza shops. The reality is that we have the hair sector, the beauty sector, the construction sector, the auto sector, the home decor sector, the FMCG retail sector, the fast food sector, we have catering sectors, we have internet cafes. I can carry on and on. We've got the herbal medicine sector and so on. Now, if you are applying a business model to the formal sector, you would not build one model that fits all. You would say, that's a restaurant sector. We have to have a different model. So Unilever has a catering division that supplies the restaurant and hotel sector, and they have a different sector that provides to the retail sector. They have another division, that does that services their wholesale sector and so on. Why do we not do that when we engage with the sector? So going back to your question, in 5 years' time, each one of those sectors will be moving in essence towards more modernization, hybridizing to being more formal, African, and so on, but slightly differently in terms of each one of their sectors, if that makes sense. Yeah,
makes perfect sense. That's a great overview in terms of where you see Africa's informal sector in 5 years' time, and you raise a very important point. I guess progress is continuous, it doesn't stop, so it keeps on evolving, which is something that's extremely important to note and to understand. If we look closer to home, where do you see yourself and the great work that you do with KasiNomic in 5 years' time?
Sure. I sold my business Minanawe to a multinational and went on my own under the KasiNomic's banner in 2018. And one of the first things that I did is that, and I do advisory work to businesses wanting to enter this sector, kind of corporate business and so on. One of the things I recognized quite quickly was that there's so many opportunities in the space that no one is wanting to take advantage of. So I've actually invested in a number of kind of startup type businesses, some not so much startups, in everything from, kind of a range of sauces under the Soweto brand name, a kind of equivalent of Tabasco, as well as something called a chakalaka, which is a South African relish. And from that all the way to an online business called Yebo Fresh that does online delivery to spaza shops and fast food shops, using WhatsApp as a WhatsApp platform, looking at working on a call it credit management business that allow for what I mentioned earlier, the ability to extend terms and manage those terms and allow businesses in the space who don't have a kind of financial record to build a credit history and a risk profile that would in essence enable us to then fund those businesses. So I'm involved in a whole bunch of these, which in essence, putting my money where my mouth is in terms of the opportunity. But that's the space that excites me, because not enough people are doing it, so where I want to be in 5 years' time is seeing those businesses not only being successful and making money for me, and my partners, but also more importantly, how those businesses can really create reciprocal benefit to the informal economy businesses that we are either supplying or servicing or delivering to, and so on. And we're seeing that already, the ability to deliver using Yebo Fresh, to deliver groceries to an outlet so he doesn't have to leave his store and go to a wholesaler, but at the same time extend him 7 days term so he can actually stock up, at least 25% more stock than he normally would have and pay for it once he's sold it 7 days later. These are the things that really enable those businesses. I've sold a lot of cheese slices and instant noodles for other people. So I see myself doing that for, so building those. And I have a very strong kind of ethic in the sense that I believe that, there's an African saying, izandla ziyagezana, which means, it's a Zulu saying, that hands wash each other. One hand can't wash itself.
Yeah.
And this concept of reciprocity is a very powerful one, where we both are successful as a result of this kind of doing business together.
Amazing.
So that's kind of where I would like to be, and kind of a rider to that says that I said to my wife, you know what, if none of these businesses are successful and I lose lots and lots of money, at least I'll have great content for another book.
There's always a positive, or I guess a learning experience from everything that you go through in life. So that's amazing.
Absolutely.
It's great to hear that. Obviously, that's something I wasn't aware of, that you've diversified what you're doing. You've gone from advisor to investor. And you also shared a great South African saying. So something that I keep as part of the podcast, I always ask each guest if they have any quotes, mantras, or proverbs, even affirmations that they use to keep them going when times are good or when times are challenging.
Quote of the week.
Yeah. So the one I'll come to is an African one, but I also believe in the one which Darwin was credited with, and apparently wasn't him, which said, evolution is about being adaptable to change.
Yes.
Is the most important thing about it. And I really apply that to myself as much as possible, that sense of, the most successful of us and businesses and species are those who are most well adapted to change. And change is a constant in the spaces that we operate in Africa, probably in the world, but no more, even more so in Africa. But one of my... in Zulu they say itendele el vugamuvali kolwa isagila, so which means that the pheasant that rises last is the one that meets the knobkerrie. So in essence, the bird that is slowest moving is the one that ends up in the dinner pot. So which again goes to that concept of the need to move fast and adapt quickly.
Brilliant. I like that one. It's been a great conversation. It's lasted a lot longer than anticipated, but that's because you've been given so much value. You've shared so much great insight and knowledge from your years of experience in terms of embedded in Africa's informal sector. So as we're coming towards the end or the close of the conversation, do you have any closing remarks and final calls to action?
Yeah, look, I think it's an exciting space, and it's I'm an African through and through, and I think that there's this need and importance of us being proud of Africa, and it's just not where there's poverty and conflict, and I believe from a business perspective we can be passionate and proud of this sector. And it's kind of a lot of what I tried to do in my book, KasiNomics and KasiNomic Revolution. That is this thing that we have something to be proud of, and we are forging something fairly unique. And often, to people, particularly people in the space, Africans in the space, is don't look out the window, look in the mirror. Because we too often look outside of our continent or outside of our township or village even, and believe that the solutions lie outside of there. And when we look in the mirror, we see around us the massive opportunity that lies there. And so that's kind of what I drive. For people in that space, my book KasiNomic Revolution is on Audible, it's on Kindle, and so on. And I obviously a lot more information and lessons and the case studies that I looked at across every sector, from fast food through to construction to herbal medicine and so on. So it's a great resource, even if I may say so. And in fact, a lot of people prefer the Audible version because some of the, which I read myself, that I'll never do again. It was my COVID lockdown project. The Audible allows one to express some of the African terminology and so on, much more fluently than when you're reading it. So anyway, it is available. It's a great resource. I'm also on LinkedIn under GG Alcock and do quite a lot of kind of ongoing commentary on this kind of space. So if anyone's looking, that's where you can find me.
What a conversation. That's been amazing. Thank you, Gigi, for your final remarks, calls to action. First-class insights, first-class guest. That was value on value on value, as I said before. So I guess thank you for your time. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us on the podcast today, and look forward to catching up soon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.